When we talk about the PlayStation 1, we usually talk about the games that defined its library: Crash, Spyro, Metal Gear. But there is one title that forced a complete shift in how we interact with our games. That title is Ape Escape. At first glance, it's a bright, colourful and admittedly purely fun platformer. It's the kind of game that puts a smile on your face the moment you start chasing your first monkey. But beneath that manic energy lies a landmark technical achievement. Before 1999, the analog stick was an optional luxury. It was a nice-to-have for flight sims or niche racing titles. Then Ape Escape arrived and did something unheard of. It made the DualShock controller mandatory. It didn't just support the sticks, it designed the entire gameplay loop around them. In this video, we aren't just looking at why this game is a blast to play, we are going to strip back the mechanics to see how the development team at Japan Studio fundamentally re-engineered the platforming genre. We'll look at how they mapped 360-degree movement and tool usage to twin sticks, why that decision was considered a massive risk at the time, and why, looking back, it effectively taught an entire generation of players how to use modern controller hardware. This is the story of how a silly game about catching monkeys became the blueprint for every 3D adventure that followed. Let's dive in. To understand why Ape Escape was so disruptive, you have to remember the state of the industry in 1999. Most developers were still designing 3D games like Tomb Raider or the early Resident Evil titles, to be played with a digital D-pad. Even if you had an analog stick, it was often just a glorified D-pad, an optional input that didn't change the game's core logic. Japan Studio flipped to that script. They didn't just add analog support, they made it a hard requirement. Why? Because the game was built around a twin stick philosophy that simply could not exist on a D-pad. In Ape Escape, your left stick handled your character's movement, but your right stick was your primary interaction tool. You were using the right stick to swing the net, control the slingshot, and steer the RC car. This was a radical departure. At the time, the industry was obsessed with auto-aim and snap-to-camera systems to compensate for poor D-pad control. By moving to dual analog, Japan Studio bypassed all of that. They gave the player full 360-degree agency over their physical actions in the 3D space. This was the difference. Most games were trying to make 3D environments feel comfortable for 2D players. Ape Escape was the first to stop compromising. It forced the player to learn a new, more complex language of interaction. It was a massive gamble. There was a genuine fear that by requiring a specific, more expensive piece of hardware, they were alienating the massive base of PlayStation owners still using the original digital controller. But that gamble paid off. It proved that 3D platforming didn't have to feel clunky or limited. It proved that if you design the hardware with the game, the barrier to entry vanishes. It wasn't just a gimmick, it was the moment the industry finally matured, moving away from the D-pad and into the twin stick era that we still use today. To understand the genius of Ape Escape, you have to look at the monkeys. In most games of the late 90s, enemies were either patrol-based, walking on fixed paths until they saw you, or aggressive-based, rushing the player immediately. Ape Escape introduced something far more sophisticated, an AI hierarchy based on personality. Every monkey in the game isn't just a generic enemy, they have their own stats for speed, attack and alertness. A monkey in yellow shorts is your standard enemy, a monkey in blue. That's a timid one, they'll spot you and immediately bolt, forcing you to use stealth or a speed gadget. A monkey in red. They're aggressive, armed with everything from slingshots to machine guns, and they will actively hunt you. This leads into the game's core loop, tool-based problem solving. Because you're using the right analog stick to control your gadgets, every encounter becomes a miniature physics puzzle. Think about the time net, you aren't just pressing a capture button, you have to physically swing the right stick in a motion that mimics the net's arc. If you mistime the swing, you miss. If you approach too loudly, they hear you. It's a rhythmic, tactile experience. You're learning to read the analog stick's output, almost like learning to play an instrument. The level design is built to reward this kind of mastery. These stages aren't just obstacle courses, they are arenas designed to facilitate the hunt. They're densely packed with environmental traps, high ground vantage points for the monkeys, and hidden paths that you can only access by cleverly using your gadgets in tandem. For instance, you might use the RC car to distract a guard monkey, switch to the slingshot to take out a high altitude target, and then execute a jump and net catch for the final monkey in the area. When you analyse it this way, you realise Ape Escape wasn't just a platformer, it was a 3D tactical sandbox. It taught us to look at the world through the lens of our tools, asking not how do I jump over this, but how do I use these sticks to manipulate this space. That is a design philosophy that frankly a lot of modern games still haven't managed to master. We often talk about graphics as the primary feedback loop in gaming, but in Ape Escape your ears are just as important as your eyes. Japan's studio treated the audio not just as an aesthetic choice, but as a critical piece of the user interface. Think about it, when you're in a high-speed chase, you have enough to worry about with the twin-stick controls. You can't afford to be staring at a UI gauge to see if a monkey has spotted you. That's where the sound design takes over. The monkey radar isn't just a visual tool, it's an auditory one. That iconic pulsing beep frequency is a distance to target indicator that lives in your periphery. The moment a monkey shifts from passive to alerted, the musical arrangement shifts instantly. You don't need a UI icon flashing in your face. The percussion in the soundtrack actually tightens. The bass becomes more aggressive, and the rhythm forces you, the player, to react faster. And then there's the soundtrack itself. It's legendary for a reason. It's a masterclass in acid jazz and electronic funk that perfectly mirrors the game's manic, playful tone. But from an engineering standpoint, it does something very specific. It maintains a constant, upbeat tempo that keeps your adrenaline high without becoming exhausting. Many games from the PS1 era relied on looping 30-second tracks that would drive you crazy after an hour. Ape Escape's compositions are expansive. They have transitions, bridges and swells that make every level feel like a living, breathing performance. It creates a rhythmic link between you and the action. When you're timing your net swing to the tempo of the drums, you aren't just playing a game anymore, you're locked into a flow state. It is quite literally a game you play by ear as much as you do by controller. The music isn't just accompanying your gameplay, it is actively pacing the hunt.
Yes!
So what is the true legacy of Ape Escape? It's tempting to look at the colourful characters and the wacky premise and call it a niche platformer. But if you take a forensic look at the current gaming landscape, Ape Escape is everywhere. Think about the standard control scheme for almost any 3D game released in the last 2 decades. Left stick for movement, right stick for camera control or gadgetry. We take that for granted today, but it wasn't an inevitable evolution. It was a choice that Japan's studio forced upon the industry. Before this game, the right stick was a wasteland of wasted space, or worse, unused hardware. By building their entire interaction model around dual analog input, Ape Escape proved to other developers that players weren't too dumb or too slow to master a more complex interface. They proved that if the payoff is intuitive control, the learning curve is worth it. It was the game that killed the D-pad's dominance in 3D space. It signalled the end of tank controls and the era of the clunky camera, forcing developers to catch up or get left behind, without Ape Escape demanding the DualShock. Would the industry have pivoted as quickly to the modern twin-stick standard? It's unlikely. Ape Escape wasn't just a game about catching monkeys, it was a masterclass in hardware-first design. It took a piece of plastic and 2 joysticks and turned them into a surgical tool. When you sit down to play a modern action game today, you aren't just moving a character, you're utilising a language of interaction that was effectively written, tested and validated by Japan's studio back in 1999. They didn't just design a hit, they designed the future of the controller itself. It's easy to look at Ape Escape today and see a charming retro relic of the PlayStation era. But as we've seen, peeling back the layers reveals a piece of software that was light years ahead of its time. Melbourne House did it for Le Mans, but Japan's studio did it here too. They took a rigid, unproven piece of hardware and turned it into the definitive language of 3D gaming. They didn't just give us a fun game, they gave us the tools to master the space around us. Ape Escape reminds us that the most important innovations in gaming don't always come from the serious shooters or the gritty dramas. Sometimes they come from a game that's willing to be a little bit silly, as long as it's backed by a foundation of absolute, uncompromising technical excellence. For those of us who grew up with these titles, these aren't just games, they're case studies in how to push hardware to its limit. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the engineering of the hunt, consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps us keep the lights on in the home lab and allows us to keep stripping back these classics to see what makes them tick. Before I go, I want to hear from you. What was that one game that made you realise the DualShock changed everything? Was it Ape Escape? Or did you have a different aha moment with your controller? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'm Brian and this has been No Drama Llama Gaming. Thanks for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.